thank you for the invitation. It's as I was saying, it's nice to see some other people. You know, it's you feel like you're trapped in your house, except for the grocery store. So I wish good health to everybody in Brazil. I think the U.S. is unfortunately still #1 for worst tragedies, but Brazil is not far behind. So my condolences if you've had any family members or friends. It's sad times. So we need to, the message is science works. You know, we need to believe in science, and also science works great with different perspectives, and international exchange of information is really an important part of science. I know Philippe is very active in International Society of Biomechanics, and this is important. You know, we're one world. We're all humans. We all are vulnerable to this terrible disease, and we need to stick together. So, okay, let's go to a happier topic. Maybe I should explain. This is a cartoon. It's kind of a famous cartoon in the United States called The Far Side. But this animal here is called a bison, and it's the mascot for our university. We're the Colorado buffaloes. So we don't. These are not super common animals, but they're very powerful, and they like to run fast. So before I begin, I just want to make sure everybody knows that I have some bias. We all have some bias. I am paid as a consultant to Nike. I'm not paid very much. I'm not paid like LeBron James or Ronaldo or any of these people, but I do get paid by them. I actually spend all that money supporting my graduate student and postdoc, but I do get paid. And my lab has had contracts to do research paid for by Nike. So you should take that into consideration whenever you hear a scientific speaker. What is their potential bias, right? Is the sound quality good? You can hear me okay?
Yeah, always perfect.
Okay. So let's start with some definitions. So running economy is the steady state submaximal rate of oxygen or metabolic energy consumption at a standardized speed. And this idea goes way back to a real pioneer in exercise physiology and physiology in general. And that's, he's one of my heroes, this guy here, A.V. Hill. And he actually measured running economy back in 1922, not 2022, 1922. And we measure this a lot in the lab. This is one of my former students here. So, very good runner. It seems like I attract lots of good athletes to my lab for some reason. So, so today I'm going to talk about how shoes affect running economy. And I'm going to talk about 3 parts, okay? Mass, cushioning, and the flexibility or stiffness of the sole of the shoe. So I don't know really any Portuguese. Is the word cushioning perfectly clear?
Amortecimento. Yes, I just told the guys about the translation, but yeah, it's. I think most of people understood.
Okay, I would actually say that most scientists who study running shoes will disagree about the actual definition of cushioning, but I just want to understand that, make sure everyone knows the concept, right? It's the softness. It's some combination of how much it compresses and how much it rebounds, and how much energy is dissipated. But we don't have a really good scientific definition of cushioning, I have to admit. All right, so the first factor is mass. So back in 1984, this guy here, his name is Ned Frederick, and Ned is the editor and founder of a journal called Footwear Science. But in relation to this story, he was the founder of the Nike Sports Research Lab. So he was the first scientist hired by Nike. And one of the first experiments he did was to answer the question, does the weight of a running shoe, does the weight affect the performance? And he found a very simple relationship, which is nice, and that is that for every 100 grams added per shoe, the oxygen consumption increases by 1%. So this is very nice to explain this to a group of scientists, especially from scientists who are not in the United States. So I don't have to explain what 100 grams is. In the United States, you have to explain what 100 grams is. So, and so hypothetically, if we decrease the shoe mass, we will decrease the rate of metabolic energy consumption at a specific speed, right? And that should allow us to increase the sustainable running speed so that, in other words, an athlete could run faster with the same physiology. Right? So that's the logic of this part of my lecture today. We turned this idea upside down. Okay, so it's not that she's in the southern hemisphere, but the idea is that if we increase shoe mass, which is a lot easier to do in the laboratory, then it would increase the rate of metabolic energy consumption, and it would slow down or decrease the sustainable running speed. So if you run with heavy shoes, we would hypothesize that you would run slower in a race. Okay? And this is this is an experiment that's possible because we can make shoes heavier. If we could make shoes lighter, we would make shoes lighter. All right. So before I talk more, this experiment was done by two of my people in my lab, Walter Hoogkamer, who some of you have met. He's now a professor. He was my postdoc before. And this woman, Shalea Kipp. And Shalea is actually a Ph.D. student at the University of British Columbia now. She's also ran in the London 2012 Olympic Games in the steeplechase event. So the experiment was pretty straightforward, but it was one that required us to be extremely careful, very sneaky. You know the word sneaky? Sneaky
in the context,
deceptive.
yes.
Yeah. Maybe the word deceptive is the same.
Okay.
That may be more common. Deceptive, yeah. So if I told you before you participated in this experiment that these shoes are heavy, up here you're going to say, sorry. If I say you're going to run in heavy shoes, your brain is going to say, oh, this is going to be harder, and we had to keep the subjects so they didn't know what shoes they were wearing, and they didn't know that the shoes were heavier. So this was a critical piece of this experiment, was that we had absolutely identical looking shoes, okay, and we never let the subjects pick up the shoes with their hand. Because if you pick up a shoe with your hand, you'll say, oh, it's heavy. But if we put it on your foot, then it turns out you can't notice it. You can't notice that the shoes are heavier unless you have it in your hand. So that was really critical. The other thing we did was that we did the experiment sessions 1 week apart, so people would forget what the shoes felt like over 7 days. And we had them do a 3,000 meter time trial on an indoor track so that we could control the temperature and the wind and keep the conditions as exactly the same as possible. We also sort of lied or were dishonest with our subjects. We told them that we were studying the repeatability of time trial performance. So we didn't tell them that they were in a study about heavy shoes. We told them that we were just doing something kind of boring like repeatability. Okay. And this is what we found. We found indeed that when we made on the horizontal axis, we have the added mass to the shoes. And on the vertical axis, we have the change in their time. So what we found on average was that when we added 100 grams to each shoe, people ran about 4 seconds slower. And when we added 300 grams to each shoe, the average person ran about 15 seconds slower. So in percentage terms, that's about 0.65% and about 2.4%, but on average, the regression says it was about a little bit less than 1% for every 100 grams. Okay. So I should say one more thing. We were very pleased by the cooperation of the subjects. We required them to maintain a log of what they ate the 24 hours before and how much sleep they had. And we asked them not to do a hard workout in the 48 hours, I think, before the experiment. And if we told them if they had a bad night, they couldn't sleep, or they felt a little bit sick, that was okay. We postponed the experiment. We tried to control every single variable that we could as much as we could. And we think we succeeded pretty well. The other factor was that we had to motivate the subjects to perform at a high level. And we did that by measuring their heart rate and telling them that we would give them an extra, I think it was $20 US, if they had their heart rate above 90% of their maximum heart rate. So we also encouraged them, we clapped, but it was kind of boring clapping because we had a script. Every subject heard the same thing. So after the first lap, we said to every subject, "Good job." And then after the second lap, we said, "That's it. Nice job. Go." It was exactly the same words, so that we weren't more enthusiastic or less enthusiastic. And we also had the same people there because sometimes people will run, these were all male subjects, and maybe all the male subjects would run faster if there was a girl cheering them on instead of a guy or something like that. So we maintained as close, we were so careful on this experiment. Okay, the bottom line is that it took a little bit less, they slowed by a little bit less than 1% for every 100 grams. Then we brought them into the lab and we measured their rate of energy consumption at a slower speed, at a submaximal speed. And we found that this increase, just very similar to what Frederick found, was about 1.11% for every 100 grams. But remember, this is at a slower speed. Anyhow, we conclude, we don't have to say hypothetically anymore, we can say on the track, in a real experiment, if you increase the shoe mass, it increases the rate of oxygen energy consumption, and it slows down the running speed. All right, we think we would say we nailed that. We established that. There is one question you might ask though. If metabolic power increased by 1.1%, but speed slowed by only 0.78%, why is this not the same number? Why is it not a 1-to-1 ratio? Well, if we go back to the Frederick paper, and you can tell this is an old paper because it was with a typewriter. So I know Philippe probably knows what a typewriter is, but the rest of you may not know what a typewriter is. It was a machine that you had to type your fingers, hit the keys with like a keyboard, but it was mechanical. Anyhow, Frederick found that there was a speed effect. It wasn't quite statistically significant, but at the fastest running speed that he tested, the increase was about 0.81%, not 1%. So we think that's pretty similar to, it obviously is similar to our 0.78% decrease in speed. Another factor that might explain our results is that although for many years I thought, and many people thought, that the rate of oxygen consumption increases linearly with running speed, there is a slight curvilinearity to the relationship, okay? So the black line is what we're gonna say is our baseline, and the gray line is if there's a 10% improvement in running economy. In other words, the gray line is 10% lower than the black line. All right, lots of numbers here. But 10% improvement in running economy makes a 12.6% increase in velocity for a slow person, an 8.2% increase in velocity for, let's say, a good runner, but only 6.7% increase in velocity for a really top runner, okay? So I think that's almost for like Eliud Kipchoge or something. He's not getting as much of a benefit from a 10% improvement in running economy. So we think this study is, in hindsight, it's not extremely surprising that heavier shoes make you run slower. But what we like about this experiment is that it's very clean. It connects exercise physiology and biomechanics and athletic performance in one study. And it also tells us, if you were making shoes, if we make the shoe 100 grams lighter, how much faster is the athlete going to be? So we think this is, it was a difficult experiment to be so careful, but not easy to do, but it was an important experiment, even if it wasn't the most surprising. It was not really a surprising result. Okay, so any questions on the first part? Now it might be a good time to make sure we...
Yeah, there is one question about the mass distribution in the shoe. It's uniform, okay. Or it's more mass in the forefoot, or...
Good question. The mass, I don't know whether you have, I'll just show you. So we put the mass was sewn into the fabric right about at the center of mass of the shoe, and also in, I don't know if it's the same word in Portuguese. We call this a tongue. The tongue of the shoe. Do you call it the tongue of the shoe? Yeah. Okay. So,
lingua.
So we had, we had small pieces of lead that Nike sewed into the tongue, so that the shoe was very balanced. The shoe didn't feel awkward. It didn't, like if you put 300 grams on the toe, it would feel horrible. It would feel really weird. Or if you put 300 grams back on the heel, it would also feel unbalanced. So it felt, of the 18 subjects after the study, we asked them, we told them, we said, oh, well, the last 3 weeks you've been running in heavy shoes. In week 2 and 3, they were much heavier. And everybody's like, really? They didn't know. And so we are pretty confident that the shoe felt normal to them. So that's a good question. It is important where you balance a shoe with the weight. Okay, time to move on?
Yes, thank you.
And how about, I think I spoke too fast during my answer there, but during the presentation, how's the speed? It's okay? A little slower, a little faster?
Well, I think it's okay, but maybe people can give some feedback in the chat. Yeah, they said it's okay. Yeah,
it's okay. All right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we talked about mass. Let's move on to the next. So Frederick's, if you think about Frederick's rule, the 1% rule, a typical running shoe now weighs about 300 grams. So if 100 grams costs 1%, then you would predict that running barefoot with no shoes would be 3% cheaper, or shoes would be 3% more expensive than barefoot, right? That's the logical extension of that. So Frederick did a follow-up experiment where they had shoes, they had people running barefoot, and they had people running with 3 different kind of sort of traditional shoes, somewhat hard, somewhat medium, and somewhat soft. And then the first Nike Air shoe was called the Nike Tailwind, and is an extremely soft shoe. So plotted on on the horizontal axis is relative hardness. So the softer shoe is to the left over here, and the hardest shoe is over here, I believe. Okay. So on the vertical axis, it's a little bit hard to read because, again, this is an old paper, but the units are the cost of transport. So it's milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per kilometer, but they're all running at the same speed. So it doesn't matter really what you put for the axis, it's a rate of oxygen consumption. And what you can see right away is that the barefoot running is basically the same. Okay, there's no real difference between these shoes compared to barefoot. And so where does this, why isn't it 3% more expensive to run in shoes? And Frederick didn't have a perfect answer, but he made a hypothesis. He said, there's no obvious explanation, but it does seem that the softer shoes showed a lower metabolic cost. And that he proposed more in the discussion section that if you're running barefoot, you have to use more muscular effort to cushion yourself when the foot hits the ground. But if you have a soft shoe there, when the foot hits the ground, you can turn off some of those muscles or turn down the muscle activity of, for example, the tibialis anterior, or possibly the vastus medialis. That this is the cost of cushioning hypothesis. And this idea has floated around for many years, but was not really directly tested until we came around in the early 2000s, 2004, 2005, 2007 or so. And there was a big movement of people who said, we should all run barefoot. Barefoot is more natural. Barefoot is a better way to run. And companies jumped on this. So of course, if you're a shoe company and someone says you don't need shoes, you go out of business. So you have to invent a shoe that looks like a barefoot, but you can still sell it to people. And if you're Nike, you can sell a shoe that is like a barefoot, right? It's a pretty amazing aspect of capitalism, right? If that we could respond to this movement by selling a product that other folks were saying you didn't need. There were lots of books back in this era. There were people who said that barefoot running is more efficient, that short barefoot strides are far more efficient. And I had a student in my lab, her name is Corbin Rusbinski, and she's now a physical therapist, but back then she was just an undergraduate student. And she said, my boyfriend is running barefoot and he tells me it's better and I want to study it in the lab. And I said, well, maybe it's better, maybe it's not better. Why don't you go to the library and find all the articles that you can find, or go online and find all the articles that have to do with barefoot running and energetics and efficiency. So Corbin came up with this graph, and it's a complicated graph at first. So along this x-axis is the mass of the shoe, right? And each of these experiments compared people running with bare feet versus running in a shoe. And the shoes varied in mass from very lightweight shoes to pretty heavy shoes. On the vertical axis is the difference in the rate of oxygen consumption between the barefoot and the shoes. Okay, so this line here, this solid line, is the 1% for every 100 grams. So this is what Frederick would predict if mass was the only factor, right? But you can see that mass is not the only factor, because most of the points are below this line. All these points are not significantly different from 0. So no difference whether you're wearing shoes or not wearing shoes. And only one study is on the line and one study is above the line. I've never understood why this study is such a weirdo. But there were problems with, like every study that I've done, every study that anybody has ever done, it's not perfect, right? But these studies were not very well controlled for several factors. One is barefoot running experience. So Frederick just took guys who had always run in shoes and said, take your shoes off and run on the treadmill. So these subjects had no barefoot running experience, at least any significant amount, right? Maybe when they go to the beach, they run barefoot a little bit, but the other thing is that the subjects ran differently. Most people, when you take their shoes away, if they run on and land on their heels when they're in shoes, when they run barefoot, they run on their toes. And they didn't control for that factor. So we thought, let's do a more careful study. Let's see if we can do a more controlled study. So my graduate student at the time, Jason Franz, who's now a professor at University of North Carolina, he helped out with this study a great deal as well. So we had 12 people who were all midfoot strikers, whether they were wearing shoes or whether they were not wearing shoes. So shod is another way of saying with shoes. These people were pretty experienced and avid barefoot runners. They either ran barefoot or in very minimal shoes, at least 30 kilometers. The average was 30 kilometers a week. I think we required them to run 15 kilometers a week. So they knew how to run barefooted. We partly did that because we wanted to be nice to our subjects. We didn't want to injure them, right? If we took someone who had never run barefoot and had them run on this treadmill that has a very rigid surface, they might get hurt. So we wanted to get people who were not going to be hurt. We started with the lightest footwear, lightest shoes we could find, these Nike Mayflies, and we added lead to them. This gets back to the question we had about the added mass. We took little pieces of lead and we took a shoe and we completely took it apart so that the only part of the shoe that was left was the fabric, was the upper part of the shoe. We got rid of the sole, we got rid of the toes. So the person was basically running barefoot with the lead wrapped around their foot so that it was firmly attached. It didn't shake around. It was connected to your foot. Okay. Sorry, it's another little bit complicated graph here. On the horizontal axis, we have the mass of the shoe, and the mass that was added to each foot. So we added 150 grams, we added 300 grams, and we added 450 grams, which if you divide by the mass of the shoe was one shoe, two shoes, or three shoes worth of weight. Okay. On the vertical axis, we have their gross rate of oxygen consumption. And the open circles here are running barefoot, and the black symbols are running with shoes. So some of this should be familiar. This line shows that if you make a shoe heavier, you increase the rate of energy or oxygen consumption by just about 1% for every 100 grams. The same or very similar, not significantly different rule applies for running barefoot. When we add mass to your bare foot, the rate of oxygen consumption increases by 1%. Okay? But the other obvious thing is that the black line, the black spots are lower than the white spots, right? So here's a different way to plot that. I've now made it percentages. Everything else stayed the same. So if we match for mass, so that now the barefoot has the same mass as the shoe, shoes are about 3 to 4% cheaper. So this point is 3 to 4%, this point is 3 to 4% lower than the barefoot line when we match for mass. So this is, again, evidence for the cost of cushioning, and it's a very direct experiment. The only thing that's different between this point and this point is that this person has a shoe on. The shoe mass is the same. They're landing on their forefoot. They know how to run barefoot. They're experienced. We controlled for every variable that we could. This experiment reminded us of an experiment done at Harvard University. One of my former professors, Tom McMahon, was the principal investigator on this study. And they made a treadmill that had a surface that deformed so that the surface could, when you stepped on it, would bend. What they found that was when they made the treadmill softer, when it was more compliant or the stiffness was lower, the rate of metabolic energy consumption was less. And it was rather considerable. When the platform deformed by 30 millimeters, there was a 12% reduction in the energy cost of running. Now, it was a small N. It wasn't a very big study, but it was telling us that cushioning was important as well. It was not on the shoe. People, I believe, still wore shoes when they ran in this study, but it's further evidence that there's a cost of cushioning. But one of my students, Christopher, he was an engineering student, and we wanted to get somewhere between shoes and between the treadmill that has a plastic surface that bends. And so what Christopher did was he got this white foam, these rectangles of foam, and figured out a way to attach them to a treadmill that's a rigid treadmill. So this treadmill is made of steel. It doesn't, when you run on this treadmill, you feel it, and it's hard. It's not like a modern treadmill. It's an old treadmill. Here's another drawing of it. So he had these pieces of foam that rotated with the treadmill. He also studied subjects who were experienced with running barefoot. They were also midfoot strikers, and he had them run without shoes in most of the conditions on the rigid treadmill. So the treadmill that is not soft, it's hard. And then a treadmill with 10 millimeter thick foam and a treadmill with 20 millimeters foam. It was the same foam. It's called EVA, which stands for ethyl vinyl acetate. It was the same shoe, same foam that was used in the Nike Free shoe at that time. So for a fourth condition, they also ran wearing these shoes on the hard deck. So what did we find in this experiment? Well, very much like the second experiment done by Ned Frederick, when we compared people running without shoes on a rigid deck, the metabolic energy was, the oxygen consumption, metabolic power was not significantly different from running with the 200-gram shoes on the hard surface. Okay? So basically the same. But when they ran on the 10-millimeter foam, they used significantly less energy, almost 2% less energy to run barefoot or unshod on 10 millimeters of foam. And then when we made the foam thicker, 20 millimeters, there was still a reduction, but it wasn't statistically significant. Okay, P was 0.322. So some foam, some cushioning seems good. And for this group of subjects who are used to running without foam, 20 millimeters was probably a little bit too much cushioning. So means can be very deceptive, right? Sometimes it's important to show your individual subjects. So this is a plot of the change in metabolic power compared to running barefoot on the hard treadmill. And this is the cushioning thickness, 10 millimeters and 20 millimeters. So Mr. Purple here, he loves the cushioning, right? He saves 6% when he's on the soft treadmill. But this guy up here, Mr. Green, or this guy here, Mr. Blue, he's like, oh, I don't like that soft foam. I use 4% more energy when I am on the soft surface. So the range from this guy to this guy is almost 10%, right? So maybe this is a good lesson for students that means can be deceptive, right? If you look at this data, you say, oh, it's everybody decreased, 1.83, but not everybody decreased. Most people decreased. And this difference here is not significant, but it's not significant because 4 people increased and 7 or 8 people had a decrease. So we make a joke, you probably have the same joke in Portuguese, but if I take this hand and I put it in a boiling hot water, and I take this hand and I put it in ice water, on average, I feel fine, right? But actually, this hand is burned and this hand has frostbite. So averages can be very misleading. I sent an email to Philippe earlier to make sure that you guys would know this story. The Cachinos dorados eos tres ursos. So we call this Goldilocks and the 3 bears. And if you remember the story from when you were a child, the Goldilocks comes in and there are 3 beds, and this bed is too soft, and this bed is too hard, but this bed in the middle is just right. So we call this a Goldilocks phenomenon, right? It's that some cushioning is good and too much cushioning is too much. So it's a sweet spot would be another way to say that. And there's some individual variation as well. So if I took my glasses and I gave them to Philippe, he wouldn't be able to see. And if he gave me his glasses and I put them on, I wouldn't be able to see, right? There is there's individuality in many physiology properties, right? In vision, in in resting metabolic rate, in nerve conduction velocity. Every variable that you look at is different between individuals. And it seems that the amount of cushioning is also individualized. Okay. Other people have found similar things. This is out of the University of Calgary with the main investigator, Darren's definition. And this was an early study on the Adidas Boost material. So this is a popular running shoe material that is more elastic. And that's shown over here on this graph, where there's a force deformation curve. So this is a test in a machine where they push the foam and then allow the foam to recoil, the sole material. And this is the control study, the control material. And you see that this area between there is larger than this area, such that this material is losing 31% of the mechanical energy that's stored in it. And this boost material is losing only 21% of the energy. So this material here is more elastic, or more resilient is another word for it, okay? It's also softer, so that for the same amount of force, this softer material, this boost material, is compressing more. Now, this was an early material. This study was 2014, and the results were that of this, 10 of the 12 subjects consumed less oxygen when they ran in this boost shoe that had the same weight as the other shoe. And the average was only about 1%, but it was statistically significant because they had such a clear pattern that 10 out of 12 subjects showed the same thing. So it's not just the amount of cushioning, but it's the properties of that midsole material. If you think about a trampoline has metal springs and returns almost 100% of the energy that's stored in it. But if you think about a material like, I don't know, I was thinking of honey. You know what I mean by honey from the bees. It's delicious, right? But it's if you press on honey, it just spreads out and it dissipates the energy. And so the material properties, how soft the material is and how resilient it is also important. All right, let me finish up here. And maybe this is a good transition because Apple used to use this as their slogan, think different, which is actually not correct English. It should be think differently, but think different. This is a picture of Darren's definition, and Darren is someone who I admire. He does think different. And so at the same time, 2006, when everybody is saying minimal shoes should be very flexible, easy to bend, he said, no, I think shoes should have should be more rigid and should act like a lever, so that the shoe over here can be curled like this. And Darren says, no, we should make the shoe so that you can't bend it at all, so that it's more rigid. And maybe this will give some advantage. And they did this study in 2014. So what they did was they had people run in the same shoe, except that it had an insole put into the shoe that was made of carbon fiber that made the shoe more stiff. Okay, so this is pretty easy to bend. This is this is a little bit stiffer, and then this is really stiff. And so what we have again is a sweet spot where the energy cost is slightly less, not very much, right? Only about 1% less energy for this maybe optimal stiffness. So it's another example of the three bears, the tres ursos, right? So there's too stiff, not stiff enough, and just right, maybe. So one of Darren's definitions, PhD students, took this and combined it. This is him. His name is Gung Lo, and Gung was a designer and scientist at Nike. And Gung was Stefanician's student. So he was around when they were making the Boost study and when they were making this carbon fiber insole study. And he went and worked, he left Calgary when he graduated and became Dr. Lo and went and worked for Nike. And he came up with, along with others, he wasn't solo, but they came up with this shoe that has, it touches on all three parts of my talk today. It's very low mass. It's less than 200 grams. The foam is new and it's very soft. It's easy to compress, but when you compress it, it bounces back. It bounces back more than any previous material used in a running shoe. It also has a carbon fiber stiffening plate, but the real innovation was in the curvature of that stiffening plate. Stefanician's previous study that saved 1% was a flat plate, but this plate has a curve to it, right? And that curve is not random. That curve was tried in different shapes, and they found this shape worked the best. So in 2015, I went to Nike, and they let me try this prototype shoe. And I was like, I mean, my hair usually stands up, but I ran in the shoe, and my hair was standing up like this. I was like, oh my God, this is a great shoe, and we'd love to study it. So we did this very thorough study of this new prototype shoe, which became eventually known as the Vaporfly shoe. Again, I'll point out some of the people. This is Wouter Hoogkamer. This is Shalea Kip, my student. Jesse Frank is one of my students. And then this is Gung, and this is his colleague, Emily, from Nike. And this is another employee from Nike who she visited, but she didn't contribute to the study, as it turns out. So this was a study which would be very difficult to do in most places of the world, because Nike wanted us to do the study on very high quality athletes. So we needed to find athletes who could run under 31 minutes for a 10-kilometer race, and they had to fit in exactly the size 10 shoes. So in Boulder, Colorado, where my university is famous for world-class runners. And it's one of the few places where we could do this. And we likened it to this, to this story of Cinderella, where they're trying to find the princess who will fit into this shoe, right? And you know, we could find people who were sub 31 minute 10K runners, but we didn't want them if they were size 11 or if they were size 9. And we needed a large sample size relatively compared to some of our previous studies, because we weren't sure how big the difference would be. So what did we do? We compared 3 shoes. We had the prototype shoe that they were most interested in, but we needed a baseline shoe. And we chose this Adidas shoe because it had this Boost material and because it had been used to set the world record in the marathon by Dennis Kimetto. And then we also chose this Nike shoe, the Streak, because it was the Nike's best shoe at the time for running marathons. Okay, so we wanted to compare to the best. We didn't want to compare to an inexpensive, not very good quality shoe. We wanted to compare it to the world record shoe. So these 3 shoes differ in their mechanics in several ways. One is that the Nike shoe has the carbon fiber plate, okay? And it has the new foam. That's the more important difference, as it turns out. So the Nike Streak over here can store, with a load of 2,000 newtons, it can store about 3 joules of energy. And it returns about 65% of that energy when you release it, okay? So and it deforms, it compresses by only about 6 millimeters. The Adidas shoe also compresses by 6 millimeters with 2,000 newtons. But it has this higher percent return. It returns almost 76% of the energy that's stored in it. But the new foam, the Pebax foam, is very soft, so that it deforms almost twice as much, right? 5.9 millimeters versus 12 millimeters. And as a result, it stores almost twice as much energy, 7.5 compared to 3.5. It stores more than half as much. And even better, it returns 87% of the energy. I don't know if it's even better, but both factors are important. The amount of energy that's stored and the percent of the energy that's returned, okay? So this is what we found. Here we have the metabolic rate in watts of energy per kilogram of body mass. So metabolic power would be a better way to describe it. And we have 3 speeds, 14, 16, and 18 kilometers an hour. So this is pretty fast. For just about anybody I know who runs would say that's pretty fast. The green dot is the Nike Streak, the purple dot is the Adidas shoe, and the orange dot is the new Nike prototype shoe. And as you can see, because I show not just the mean data points, but each individual, of every single individual of 18 had lower energy in the Nike prototype shoe at all 3 speeds, right? So 18 out of 18 used less energy. And the amount of energy that they used less was basically 4%. 4% compared to the best Adidas shoe, and 4% savings compared to the previously best Nike shoe. Again, we see a pretty large individual response. Some individuals didn't save, let's see if I can find, I don't have it on here. Some individuals only saved about 1.6%, but some individuals had big savings and saved over 6%. So my friend who's a statistician, I said, oh, we don't even need stats, because we had 18 subjects. We still did statistics, but when you have 18 subjects who show the same pattern every single time, every single speed, it's pretty obvious that there's an advantage. And Nike, when the shoe was produced, put this little sticker on the side of the sole, and that's as close as I'm going to get to being Michael Jordan, where I have a shoe named after me. But I like this measured in the lab. So many of us are biomechanists, not just energetics people. How can we explain this? What were the differences? And it turned out externally, if we look, pretty superficially at the whole body level, there's not much difference, right? The force traces look very similar. The peak forces are not any different. The braking and propulsion looks very similar. So we did a follow-up study to look a little bit more carefully at the biomechanics. This was on the previous study. The energetic study included both midfoot and rearfoot strikers, people who landed on their heel and people who landed more on their toes. The energetic savings were almost exactly the same between those two groups. But because the biomechanics might have been very different, we decided to follow up on the more detailed biomechanics with just rearfoot strikers. We did full motion capture on a force measuring treadmill. Going into this, we expected that the Nike prototype shoe, because it was soft, because it had a lot of, it was easy to compress, we thought that the shoe was doing the cushioning, and that the knee flexion would be reduced and the peak moment at the knee would be reduced when they ran in the Nike prototype shoe. But because the shoe has this rigid plate, we thought that the mechanical advantage would be such that the ankle extensor moment would actually be greater. And again, because the sole of the shoe is stiff, we anticipated and hypothesized that the work done at the metatarsal phalangeal joint, the toe joint, would be less. So what did we find? Well, here we've got just the kinematics. We've got the joint angles at the hip, the knee, the ankle, and the metatarsal phalangeal joint, and the three colors for the different shoes. The orange is the one that's most important or relevant. That's the Nike prototype shoe, what became known as the 4% shoe. So there's really nothing very exciting at the hip, and we were clearly wrong. We hypothesized less knee flexion, but that didn't take place. It's nearly identical. And we did hypothesize that there would be less dorsiflexion at the metatarsal phalangeal joint, and our data support that, right? The orange line doesn't flex as much as the more compliant shoes, the shoes that are easier to bend. What about our other hypotheses? We hypothesized that the knee moment would be less in the Nike prototype shoe. Nope, X, that was not correct. And we hypothesized that the peak ankle moment would be greater in the Nike prototype. But that was not the case as far as the moment goes. There was, however, you can see that there was less negative work and less positive work at the ankle joint. So it's not immediately, it's obvious that these are the same. It's pretty clear that these are less work being done at the ankle. And we'll talk about why that is a little bit more. The metatarsal phalangeal joint work, as you can see here, the integration, the area under this power curve, there was less metatarsal phalangeal joint work. And there's actually very little energy stored in the carbon fiber plate. So this is the amount of the power, the area of the curve is indicating the energy. And the really notice that the scale is only half a joule, whereas at the ankle joint and the knee joint, the axes are 24 joules. So really very little energy is stored in the plate. In other words, the carbon fiber plate is absolutely not acting like a running prosthesis that is made of carbon fiber that does store a tremendous amount of energy. The carbon fiber plate is acting like a lever. It's acting like a rigid, almost like a rigid body, but it has a curve to it. So there's a lot of work. There was a paper just came out yesterday, actually, on this very topic. There's still a lot to be learned about how the carbon fiber plate, if the carbon fiber plate is adding a benefit in terms of energy, and more importantly, why and where is the savings taking place? Which muscles is it taking place at, and how is the muscle behavior changing? The force length properties, the sarcomere length changes, and so on. So just to sum up, it's pretty clear that to improve performance, if we improve running economy, we can improve performance. We find that shoes that are lighter should provide better performance. In terms of cushioning, the material needs to be compliant, easy to compress, and bouncy. It has to return a lot of that energy. And in terms of the bending stiffness of the shoe, it needs to be stiff, but not too stiff. And it appears so far that the curve of that plate is important as well. One of my colleagues at Nike, Emily Farina, has been doing a lot of that work as well. I wanted to give her credit. She's looking at keeping everything controlled except for the shape of the plate. And there's, again, a Goldilocks optimal plate. This is kind of the end result. When you make a really fast shoe and you have a really fast athlete, they win marathons, set world records, and even break 2 hours. And the shoe certainly helps them to some degree, But if I put on these shoes, I'm not running even a 3-hour marathon. So it's not just the shoes, it's the athlete and the shoes that result in high level performance. Okay, that's what I have to talk about today. Sorry, I didn't realize I was having so much fun talking for so long, but I hope that's okay with you guys.